So tonight, our talk is going to be on Catholicism and Orthodoxy, prospects for reunion. We're going to do this in kind of an unusual manner in the sense that it'll break into two parts, both relatively short. The first is I will give from the Latin Catholic point of view a quick narration of the relationship between the two churches. And then, subject, of course, to corrections and amendations by the doctor. When I've done with that, he will take it up and discuss specifically Orthodox ecclesiology and its effect on the prospects for reunion. Obviously, the quick narration I'm going to give you is from the Latin Catholic point of view. So bear that in mind. First and foremost, you'll recall that the church began at Pentecost with the descent of the Holy Ghost upon the 12 apostles, and of course, out of the disciples who were with them. Now, early on, there were three major sees. The first, in point of time, was Antioch, founded by St. Peter. The second was Alexandria, founded by St. Mark, and then Rome, likewise founded by St. Peter. And we believe, of course, that the primacy of the church, the headship of the church, went with St. Peter to Rome. That having been said, however, the patriarchs of Antioch and Alexandria ran their own shows to a great degree in terms of internal governance and so forth. In time, Constantinople and Jerusalem were elevated to equal status. So this was called the Pentarchy. 5 patriarchates. 4 in the west and 4 in the east, 1 in the west. And for the first 1,000 years, with a notable exception of the 800s, these were in communion with one another. The exact nature of that communion and how things worked is precisely the area of conflict, division, and controversy. But speaking from the Roman point of view, major questions of doctrine at the end of the day were settled by ecumenical councils with the what's the word I'm looking for? Golly, with the sanction of the Holy See, of the Pope. Now, this sounds very, very idyllic, but of course there were other things happening. The first major heresy, other than Arianism, to run the church was Nestorianism. Now, a very important thing to bear in mind. I presume that everyone here knows about the apostolic succession. If you've never heard of it, ask them the questions. But you had a network of bishops under those 5 patriarchates that went all the way from the British Isles into Persia. The Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, and now we're in the 400s, 300s and 400s. Persian Empire and the Roman Empire are at loggerheads politically. And the Christians are very much suspect by the Persians as friends of Rome, as a fifth column, so to speak. Well, there is our first great division, the Nestorian heresy, which is the idea that there are 2 persons in Christ, and that because there are 2 persons, Our Lady is not the Mother of God, only Mother of Christ. Now, what happened in the end was that at the Council of Ephesus, Nestorianism was condemned, but when it was condemned, the corned beef and cabbage, what a temptation. When it was condemned, the adherents of Nestorianism fled over the frontier to Persia. And the Persian church was, with the collusion of the Persian authorities, made Nestorian. Now, this in itself is the beginning of a really extraordinary chapter of church history. And eventually the Nestorian church ran all the way from Persia into India and China. But the network of dioceses they developed, all that kind of thing, very interesting stuff, but not germane to our story. What did happen was that in reaction to that particular heresy, another one arose called Monophysitism. And that said that there is only one nature and one person in Christ, divine. Now, at this point, I have to emphasize, too, that just as the surviving the survivors of the Nestorian Church, the Assyrians as they're called, often deny that they really believed or the heresy that was imputed to them. So too with the descendants of the Monophysites. They were what we call now Armenians, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Copts, the Ethiopians. Nevertheless, they refused to accept the Council of Chalcedon that condemned Eutyches, he being the major Monophysite theologian. In here, however, you see the beginning of the division of the ancient patriarchates. Now, the emperor at Constantinople enforced orthodoxy, and bound up with the religious questions were national ones. So, refusal to accept Chalcedon became a badge of Coptic, Ethiopian, Syriac, Armenian nationality. And the adherents of Chalcedon were referred to as the emperor's men, or royalists. And that's a word you may know today as Melkite. So, what happens? The Monophysites form alternative hierarchies with valid orders by our standards, as had the Assyrians. So from that erupt the Armenian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, and later on, for very varied reasons, the Indian Orthodox or Malabar Orthodox churches. And these folk break with Rome and Constantinople, who are on the same sheet of music at that point. Well, then come the iconoclastic folk, the great heresy of iconoclasm. If you were old enough and you were Catholic, you got a taste of it in the 60s. But, sorry, that was a low blow. I didn't mean it to sound quite as nasty as it did, or did I? Anyway, so iconoclasm, of course, taught that statues and icons and all those things were graven images as forbidden to the children of Israel. Now, one of the important things to bear in mind is that in the West, although eventually the emperors always came down on the side of orthodoxy, a number of emperors at different times acted as patrons of heresy. So, for instance, Justinian, who is the saint in the East, and I think rightly so, nevertheless, due to his empress, was very soft on Monophysites. Earlier on, of course, the sons of Constantine had been soft on Arianism, and were not actively promoting it. And iconoclasm was actually imposed by several emperors. This, and the declining ability of the Byzantine Empire to protect Italy from the Lombards and people like that, forcing the Pope of Rome to become ever more a temporal ruler. Somebody had to do it. These things combined to bring about a gradual de-Easternization of the Western Church. Now, what's interesting about this too is that there was a period of disunion, the Phocian schism in the 800s. And to this day, many Orthodox historians resent the revival of the Roman Empire in the West under the aegis of Pope St. Leo III, Charlemagne. Again, it is as it is. From that time forward, as far as the popes were concerned, the Holy Roman Emperors were every bit as much Roman emperors as Constantine had been. But for obvious reasons, in the East, they were often regarded as usurpers. And all this contributed to the growing disaffection. Now, the Carolingian Empire collapsed into feudalism, as we know. The church got stronger in the West in a temporal sense because of this. But the worst chapter in the history of the papacy thus far, longest lived, came in the 900s, into the 1000s. And this was the famous pornocracy. Isn't that a great word, the pornocracy? If you didn't know better, you'd think it described our own government today. But fortunately it doesn't, of course, and even mentioning that, I think, is treasonous. Just putting it that way. But anyway, the pornocracy was a terrible time when the papacy was literally the plaything of the mistresses of some of the higher nobility of Rome. It was a terrible, terrible time in our history. However, and now I'm getting ready to dump everything on the doc. Getting very soon, not quite. So wake up, Doc, wake up. No, the thing is that That nadir, however, did not, and this is an important point from our point of view, it did not interrupt the relationship between Rome and Constantinople. And Vladimir Soloviev, the great Russian writer, put it this way: the East had no difficulty with the pornocracy. It was only when the chair of Peter was once again occupied by men of apostolic character that difficulties ensued. So that, of course, was the great break in 1054, the mutual excommunications, and in the, if you'll excuse the expression, religious folklore that comes down to us for the present day, that is the date of the Great Schism. I say religious folklore because from the Western point of view, that's not really the date from which the schism begins. Because, as we know, there were several attempts at reunion. Now, in 1071, a terrible thing happened less than 20 years after that great schism, and that was the Battle of Manzikert, when the Byzantine emperor and his armies were wiped out and the Muslims seized control of Asia Minor. Now, before I say anything further, this is just for you to contemplate. Remember that there was a time when Asia Minor, when Syria, when Palestine, when Egypt were as Christian as Russia or Romania or Italy or Spain. It's important to remember that. We forget that. Anyway, unfortunately, this was precisely the time when the Pope Gregory VII was tied up in fighting the then Holy Roman Emperor. He had actually, upon getting a request for help from the Eastern Empire, had desired to go on crusade himself. And there's some interesting correspondence surviving of Pope Gregory VII's efforts in this area. But instead, he died in exile in Naples. This was the Pope of Canossa and all that, if you've heard of these things. If not, doesn't matter. So, what happens? Finally, the problems in the West are solved, and at the same time, things in the East are getting worse. The then Caliph orders the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre. And instead of simply being charged an arm and a leg for arriving in Palestine, pilgrims are literally being enslaved and murdered. And you can imagine if that's what they were doing to pilgrims who had been a steady source of income, the life of the local Christians was worse. That was what called forth the Crusades. The First Crusade was the most successful. I would go so far as to say it was the most successful for an important reason. That was the time when East and West, of all the Crusades, that was the time when they were the most united. There were all sorts of problems and dissensions between them. But all in all, that was the most effective attempt at cooperation militarily that they had. Well, the Crusades, however, as we know, became something rather different from what they were intended. I don't want to bore you with the detailed history, but suffice to say that in 1182 in Constantinople, there occurred something called the Massacre of the Latins, when all the Latin women and children in Constantinople were killed and their churches destroyed. That was not a nice thing. Neither was the Fourth Crusade's looting and ruin of Constantinople. One of the things, ladies and gentlemen, that I've always felt as a historian is that history never lets anyone get too smug. If you're of the belief that your particular ethnic group has always been right, study your neighbors' histories. They'll show you how wrong you were. The good part is that you can show them how wrong they were. But nobody gets out utterly innocent. Moving right along, however, there was another attempt in 1215 at reunion, which failed. The most successful came in the 1400s, 1436, I believe. I could be wrong date-wise, but it's that time. Council of Florence. And this, of course, was an attempt by the last Byzantine emperors to reunite the churches specifically for the purpose of saving Constantinople from the threat of the Turks. In the event, it was unsuccessful. But, and here comes the but, from the Western point of view, the schism does not date from 1054, but from 1462. when the Patriarch Germanos II, who had been selected by the Sultan, as all the patriarchs of Constantinople would be until 1923, an era that's called in their history the Turkarchia. He broke the union. But he was an interesting fellow, was Germanos II. Why? He was a Thomist. Now,
Gennadios.
Gennadios, I said Germanos, Gennadios. I told you to correct me when I'm wrong. Why didn't you correct me? I said correct me, you didn't correct me. All right, never mind. It was Gennadios II. He was a Thomist, a follower of St. Thomas Aquinas. He differed with St. Thomas in two particular areas. One, as you might guess, the papacy. But the second was he affirmed the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which St. Thomas denied. So, having said all of that, that is, from our point of view, when the schism begins. But, fast forward about 200 years, Vatican I. Blessed Pius IX calls what we consider an ecumenical council, Vatican I. He invites the patriarchs in union with Constantinople to the council, not as observers, but as full participants. Their responses, except for the Patriarch of Antioch, who actually responded with a very respectful letter, the other responses weren't so nice as you might imagine. But, nevertheless, it's obvious that Pius IX, who I don't think anyone could consider a wild-eyed ecumenicist, was quite concerned about reunion with the East, and the fact that our relationship with them is, from our point of view, completely different from that with the Protestants or any other non-Catholic body. Move forward a few more years. We come to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. This is a very important occasion for us, for tonight, for our discussion, because there were no Catholic chaplains in the Russian army, though there were Japanese POWs that they captured. There were no Russian Orthodox chaplains in the Japanese army, although they captured Russians. So Pope St. Pius X and the Holy Synod of Moscow worked out a deal for intercommunion. The Japanese priests could give communion to the Russian Orthodox prisoners, and vice versa. And again, I do not know of any Orthodox, however Rocor they might be, who would consider the Holy Synod in 1905 to be a hotbed of liberalism. I don't think there are too many traditional-minded Catholics who would consider Pope St. Pius X a wild-eyed ecumenicist. So, if we fast forward a little bit further, and that little bit further is 1962, the Mount of Olives, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras II, the Pope of Rome, Paul VI, mutually lift the excommunications of 1054, which, as much as anything, are supposed to be the juridical basis of the schism. Lastly but not leastly, ladies and gentlemen, as I say, from our point of view, the schism really begins in 1462, legally. I have to say, just speaking personally now, and not for Catholics as a whole, that I find it very difficult to accept a schism imposed by a sultan. So as far as I'm concerned, the Orthodox are as much my brothers as the Catholics, just so you know. Though I don't feel that way about the sultan. And now, having stated, so far as I know it, the Latin historical piece, I will defer to my colleague who will speak to you about Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology in this context.
Well, thank you, and that was a very good overview of the, a very good historical overview, which really sets the context for really how things are today. So ecclesiology. It is, well, first of all, to kind of get a clear sense of what we're talking about. How many of you are familiar with the term ecclesiology? Okay, quite a few of you are.
How many here aren't?
How many of you are not?
Show of hands. You've never
Show
heard
of hands.
ecclesiology.
Ecclesiology. Okay, so
Maybe met her in a nightclub. That was it.
Yes, ecclesiology. A hot date. No, just kidding. No, ecclesiology is. It comes from the word ecclesia. All right, ecclesia is the root. It's a Greek root word. Anything having to do with the doctrine of the church, the nature of the church, what the church is, what constitutes the church. Those are the questions that ecclesiology deals with. Now, when looking at the difference between Orthodox and Catholic, Roman Catholic ecclesiology, Eastern Orth, I guess the best way to describe it is that in Roman ecclesiology, in Roman Catholic ecclesiology, the ecclesiology is basically a communion of churches around the See of Peter, right? The See of Peter being the place, which is the touchstone of unity for the churches, for all the churches. And of course, in the Catholic Church, we have, most of you are basically familiar with the rite that is pretty much the predominant rite of the Roman Catholic Church worldwide, and that is the Latin Rite. For all of you, many of you Catholics, maybe that's basically all that you've been really, whether it's the Tridentine usage or the usage of Pope Paul VI. In either one of those usages, or maybe both, maybe you've experienced both those usages, but the Roman Catholic Church is also a communion of lots of other rites as well. The Byzantine rite being one, the Chaldean. Of course, a lot of the Chaldean churches have been on the news recently because of all the unpleasantness that ISIS has heaped on them in Iraq. One of the most ancient monasteries, Chaldean monasteries there, has been pretty much destroyed by ISIS. But there's the Chaldean rite, the Coptic rite, and there's also one Eastern rite that has no equivalent in the Eastern Orthodox, and that's the Maronites. Yes, thank you. The Maronite rite. That one has it's basically an Antiochian rite, but it doesn't. It's really its own thing, and it really doesn't have any equivalent in the Eastern Orthodox. So basically, that just reaffirms, this concept that the Roman Catholic Church being sort of a family of churches in communion with the See of Peter, right? The See of Rome, and Rome, as I said. The papacy is kind of the touchstone of unity in the midst of these for all of these communions. So for all of these in this communion of churches, and the Pope having an authority, a binding authority that brings them together. But in Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology, we have and really I'm putting this in the best possible terms as I can, right? There's really no attempt here in creating straw men, right? That you simply knock down, and because that's easy, right? Like I tell my students. When we study St. Thomas Aquinas, you notice how St. Thomas Aquinas will start recreating the best arguments of his opponents, right? And those are the best and they're very persuasive before he responds to them, right? Now, it's not that I'm going to knock down Orthodox ecclesiology or anything like that, but Orthodox ecclesiology, in its best articulation, is a family of independent churches, all of which are jurisdictionally they're independent, but their communion is basically determined by, well, whether or not you could really receive communion, right? Or how whether or not their bishops acknowledge each other during the in the liturgical prayers, right? There is no binding canonical authority. We call the Patriarch of the Patriarch of Constantinople the ecumenical patriarch for a variety of reasons. One of which is, in the times of the Byzantine emperors, he was in charge of the ecumene within the Byzantine Empire, and that's where the term ecumenical. He is the ecumenical patriarch of all wherever the Byzantine Empire sort of holds sway, right? Those are part of his flock. Now, what does it mean to be an ecumenical patriarch in this era, right? Especially after briefly during the Turkiya, under the Turkiya, a lot of these bodies within Asia Minor, Anatolia and so forth, were brought back into under the authority of the ecumenical patriarch. But now after the Turkiya, right, when these are all different nations now, when you have all these different nations, what does it mean for the ecumenical patriarch to be the ecumenical patriarch? But that's a different. According to Orthodox ecclesiology, the ecumenical patriarch holds a primacy, a kind of primacy, but a primacy of honor, which carries no binding authority over all the other churches, all the other Orthodox churches. And Father Fenton, did I articulate that pretty okay? Yes. In a very simple form. Yeah. And again, a lot of what I'm saying here is going to be very simple, right? Because I'm trying to break it down for you in as simple a way as possible. Again, there's maybe a little more to it, but that's its simplest articulation, right? That's the simplest articulation of Orthodox and ecclesiology, especially in relation to the ecumenical patriarchate. Now, I don't know how many of you have kind of kept up with. For many of you, this might be a little new, but lately there had been, for the last maybe 50 years or so, there had been quite a bit of friction between the ecumenical patriarch and the Patriarchate of Moscow. Right? How many of you know about that? Okay, some of you know a little bit about that.
I know.
Yeah, right. Jesus, gosh. Yes. If you didn't know about that, then we'd have problems here. But this friction between the two patriarchates, it is kind of it brings up some interesting ecclesiological issues, right, in terms of how one mitigates problems between two bishops. There is, and again, the Greeks might say one thing, might have their version of the story. The Russians have another, may have their it kind of goes back to what you said earlier, right? About
my people are always right.
My people are always right, yours are always wrong, right? It's kind of the same thing between the patriarchate, those who really, the Greeks who have who have a passionate, especially those who have a passionate love and connection with the ecumenical patriarchate, with the patriarchate of Constantinople, and of course the Russians, the Russians are, by the way, are probably by and large the largest, right? By far the largest jurisdiction, right? The ecumenical patriarchate has basically for all its for all the grandiosity, is that a word, grandiosity, that the name implies, his flock is really limited to basically Turkey, that little, and the United States, right? There are some Greek, most, if not all, of the Greek churches here are under the authority of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, right? Now, let me take you back to 1994. In 1994, there was a scuffle. There was a temporary excommunication. I think it was in 96. There was a temporary scuffle between Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople and then Patriarch Alexei of Moscow, right? And that brought some huge questions about how the parishes here were in the United States were supposed to relate to each other. I mean, what would be the relationship between those churches, especially that are under the Patriarchate of Antioch, with the Greeks and the Russians, right? It really brought a lot of confusion. It didn't last. It eventually things mended, but the situation is still very tense between the two, between Bartholomew and now Kirill, the current Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill. But again, ideally, these are all sister churches. These are sister churches that basically are independent. Many of them are autocephalous. How many do you know the word autocephalous? All right.
I know.
Yes, I knew you did. And I'm to my Mr. Rogers moment here. And how many of you do not know what autocephalous means?
You've never heard of autocephalous.
You never heard of autocephalous. He was a good friend of ours back in the big band days. Autocephalous.
Autocephalous. He was Glenn Miller's biggest rival.
So autocephaly mainly means self-governing. Auto from the word alone, right? And cephaly meaning head, one head, right? In a certain geographical area.
If I may interject, very very quickly, one of the things that makes it difficult for an outsider looking at Orthodoxy in the United States is that in Europe and Asia, the ancient patriarchates, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and then the new Orthodox bodies that came after the liberation of Eastern Europe from the Ottomans.
Yeah.
Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Greece, etc., and Russia. They all have separate jurisdictions over here.
Yeah.
That was not the case until 1917.
Yeah.
Before World War I, the Russian Orthodox controlled all Orthodox churches in the United States.
That's right.
Yeah, but after, it's kind of an important thing to bear in mind, after the Russian Revolution, that whole setup collapsed in this country. And a lot of the reasons why you see so many different Orthodox jurisdictions here is because it was their attempt to make up in the wake.
Yeah.
So, pardon my interest.
Oh no, that's a very and thank you for that. That's a very that is a very, very important point to keep in mind, because it's true. Up until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Russia ran the show here in the States, basically. Bishop Tikhon was before he became Patriarch Tikhon, was basically was a kind of missionary bishop, working mostly through Alaska and the West and the western portion of these United States. And it was Russia that provided much of so the Greeks and the Antiochians and all these other the Bulgarians and whoever, they were all served. Many of them were served by priests who spoke the language of the communities, and some of them actually, like what's his name, Bishop Raphael, it's now Saint Raphael Hawawini, from Syria. Was Syria or Lebanon? Was he Syrian, or I think he was Syrian. Yeah, that's right. And so he went to Moscow, and it was and from Moscow he was sent to New York, right? And but you know, his superiors were not in Antioch; they were in Moscow. His superior was in Moscow. Now, but some Russian priests actually were Greek speaking too, and they served Greek parishes. So Moscow really had a very large presence here. They basically ran the show. After 1917, that changes. Now everybody kind of reverts back to their to the patriarchates back home. Now, and this is very and this becomes problematic. And Father Fenton could probably speak to this later on a little bit, because canonically there could only be one jurisdiction per geographical area. Notice I said geographical area and not national boundaries, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind. But with the fall of Moscow, with the fall of Moscow, it was now you have these multiple jurisdictions basically running the show, running their own show, and many of them basically forming their, as some might call it, their own fiefdoms, right? And very jealous if you start getting into my territory here, right? There's a lot of jurisdictional jealousy that takes place there. Now, in Catholicism, we've had such issues too. Again, this is not. Nobody is. Just like Brother Charles says here. Nobody has a right to be smug, right?
History takes it away from us all.
History takes the great muse Historia, right? takes smugness away from all of us. Because in New York, especially just a small area in New York, you had the Italians, you had Irishmen, Germans, and they would never even darken the door of each other's churches. And you also had jurisdictional battles between some of their clergy.
I'd just like to insert here that the late and perhaps not so lamented Archbishop of Ireland of St. Paul, Minnesota.
Yes.
He's one of my favorite characters because he was ultimately responsible for not one but two schisms.
Yes.
Takes a lot of work to do one schism, ladies and gentlemen. But when you find somebody who can do two, this is a man who deserves promotion.
That's right.
That's right. It was, on the one hand, he was able to annoy sufficient Poles to be instrumental in the creation of what's called the Polish National Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But he was also to show that he was equal opportunity, not just Latin Rite. He could annoy Eastern Rite people too. and he was able to drive a lot of Ruthenians out of the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Their leader was a Father Alexis Toth,
Toth, yeah.
which is actually a Magyar name, so if you're Hungarian, be happy or something. But his initial annoyance with Father Alexis was that Father Alexis did not genuflect, it being the Eastern custom to bow profoundly. So when Father Alexis bowed profoundly to him, he was very upset. And being Irish, of course, he knew there was no true church outside Ireland. But seriously, I would also like to just quickly touch on one other element here, and that is that from the Western point of view, what this looks like is sheer chaos. And one of my little jokes is that there are two differences between Catholics and Orthodox.
Yeah.
The one is that in the West, authority has eaten up tradition, to where those in charge can simply say, we're all going to wear underwear on our heads now, and we do. But in the East, so it seems to me, tradition has eaten up authority. Now, contrariwise, another joke of mine, I like to say that we Catholics will tolerate any amount of heresy, but no schism. The Orthodox will tolerate any amount of schism, but no heresy.
Yes.
Almost as though they were meant to correct each other's excesses.
And that's the point, right? It seems like we're kind of meant to sort of balance each other's crazier tendencies.
Not that we have them.
Of course we don't. Of course, yeah. So that's basically, that I think that's a good articulation of. I think that breaks down pretty well what the major difference, at least one major difference. In the West, especially what you said, among the Latins, authority eats up tradition, whereas in the East, tradition eats up authority. Two very crazy tendencies that should actually work together. It's kind of like a marriage, right? I'm going to steal this from you because you actually made this analogy to me once, and I'm going to articulate it here. Let's say that how many married folks are here? I see
Who
one
here are married.
Okay.
Who here are happy? Nope.
So let's say that you gentlemen are enjoy hunting and fishing, and you wives enjoy garden shows. All right, this is 2017, so maybe it's the other way around. I don't know, but however that Diana the Huntress, yes. However that works out, let's say, but let's just work with this analogy. So on one weekend, you gentlemen can be the great huntsman and fisherman, and and you ladies could go out and knock yourselves out. You could be the great green thumb and knock yourselves out at garden shows, right? But then during the week, all the other weeks of the month, you find out you basically choose things that you could all do, that you can do together, and so you balance each other out, right? Now, when you get divorced, if you get divorced, not when.
Contrary to what you may have thought from the statistics,
if you get divorced, now you can devote all your time, your weekends, to being the great huntsman, and you can devote all your weekends to being the great green thumb. But now, so you're free, but not in a way that's good for you. That's necessarily good for you, right? I think there's a sense in which, and you see this, with the separation, especially in ecclesiology, right? How it works out in this strange way, when you have in the part of the East, in the Eastern Church, you have what could be called, sometimes feuding churches, and and what body is there to kind of mitigate these disputes? Basically, there's very little, or if there's anything, to really mitigate those disputes. I think one example. Well. And also, when your ecclesiology is kind of scattered in this way, or I don't want to say scattered, but you have all these independent churches, when things kind of become, when you start to, major questions come up like, well, the status of Latin sacraments, right? Are Latin sacraments valid, or are they not valid? I want to read something here from Metropolitan, or one of my favorite Russian. I just love this man, by the way, he actually composed a beautiful. I think it's a St. Matthew Passion. Archbishop Hilarion Alfeyev. What's that? Oh, you said of blessed, or you said to bless.
You said peace be upon him.
Peace
Go
be
ahead.
upon him.
He's a contemporary, still alive.
He's still alive. He's still very much with us. I have actually heard some people call him the Russian Ratzinger. Interestingly enough.
He's the Secretary of State for the Moscow Patriarch.
Yep. But, as far from his perspective, he says, this is from Vetrograd Orthodox Journal in 2009. He says, to all intents and purposes, mutual recognition of each other's mysteries is another word for sacraments, already exists between us. We do not have communion in the mysteries, but we do recognize each other's mysteries, declared Archbishop Hilarion Alfeyev on the air during the broadcast of the program. The Church of the World, the program's called The Church of the World on television, on the television channel Russia on October 17th. If a Roman Catholic priest converts to Orthodoxy, we receive him as a priest, and we do not reordain him. And that means that de facto we recognize the mysteries of the Roman Catholic Church, explained Archbishop Hilarion. Okay, so that's Archbishop Hilarion of Russia. And it's true, in the Russian Patriarchate, a relatively recent example of this was when Father Gabriel, the Byzantine Catholic monk Gabriel Bunge, was actually received into the Russian Orthodox Church. Basically, there was a vesting, but there was not what is called a reordination. Right? He was basically received as a priest. Right? Now, contrary-wise, there is
My favorite Greek.
one of my favorite Greeks. What's that? Zorba the Greek. No, this is Metropolitan Seraphim, I think, of Piraeus. Now, that name may not mean anything to you, but if you Google him, you will find that he has made some pretty interesting statements about the Latin Church, and they're not flattering at all. He basically calls the Latins, basically. I have the whole. I'm not. Oh boy! As soon as I mention Metropolitan Seraphim, it's something always happens.
It's true. Mirrors break.
Mirrors break.
In my house, I mentioned his name once. Every mirror in the place broke. It was amazing.
But he basically says, basically came out with a statement, and I have the correspondence between him and the Latin Archbishop of Athens, a Roman Catholic Archbishop of Athens, basically saying, and these are his words, "You are not a church, you are a heresy." Right? So what does that mean for Latin sacraments? They are null and void. The Latin sacraments are completely and utterly invalid. The Latins don't get sacraments, right? And in his view, after 1054, every saint that the Roman Catholic Church has produced is a rank heretic, including Francis of Assisi, right? So you have that extreme view, and then you have every view within the spectrum, right? You have every view in the spectrum there. So great, that's basically where things stand. Now, who decides which one of which one of these within the spectrum, within the whole spectrum, is correct? Now, in the Catholic Church, we have seen too some attempts at overreach. Where authority, as you say, authority tends to swallow up tradition, yeah. And with that, there are certain. There are certain
horrendous
attempts,
issues?
Horrendous issues involving overreach.
Yeah.
You see it even in the papacy today. Now, the way that this all will work out will be interesting, because today we will see just I think with what's going on in Rome today. We're going to see just what the limits of the papacy really are.
And that, there are a couple of things here to bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Every Orthodox friend I've had, and I've had quite a few of them actually. I'm amazed to have any friends at all, but I do have some. Often enough, they'll talk to me about papal tyranny, which kind of makes me giggle because all my life I've lived under episcopal tyranny. Since in my lifetime, the bishops, in this country anyway, have run the show without much reference to Rome. That began to change under Benedict, and now we have a pope who is extremely interested in centralization. And yet, I hate to mention this, but I did write a history of the papacy.
Yes.
It's
Get the
true.
book, it's good.
It is true. I liked it. But,
Pope St. John Paul II also liked it. He made him a papal knight. That's true.
It's true, but not my fault. I didn't ask for it. But the thing is that what I think you're going to see here in the next few years is an ever clearer definition of what can and cannot be done with the papacy. It was interesting that recently the Holy Father wanted the soon-to-meet Synod of Bishops to discuss ordaining married priests in the Latin Rite, and the Synod voted it down. They've got another agenda. So what we're seeing, and this again is in keeping with the entirety of the history of the Church, you tend to see theological questions worked out over a long period of time. The definitions, as with the Arians, may come really soon, but the whole drama and what everything means very often goes on and on and on. A second thing to bear in mind, too, is that with our view, the Catholic view of the East is very different. Because we are centralized, we do have, as it were, a single party line regarding them. Now, you'll have heard, like a man like I can't say his name because I don't want glass to break again, but the Metropolitan of Piraeus, strictly speaking, we would consider him a heretic. But we never impute heresy to orthodoxy as a whole. Why is this? It's because as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, no Orthodox body is capable of promulgating heresy. Why? Because by their own standards, nothing that is not included within the 7 ecumenical councils can be held as an absolute belief. And since we accept those 7 councils as well, we can never hold that Orthodoxy as a whole is heretical. They may have heretics among them, but then so do we. We're celebrating Martin Luther this year. So the thing is, then, in saying this, the question then comes up, what prospect is there for reunion? Now, the current Patriarch of Moscow made a comment which, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, from the first time I heard it, my heart kind of swelled. He was talking to Der Spiegel, as people do, and, well, no, they do, usually in German, strangely enough. But what he said was that the break between East and West was like a divorce. Oh, and let me just say parenthetically, too, St. Thomas Aquinas tells us that, subjectively speaking, schism is worse than heresy. Objectively, heresy is worse because it's a perversion of the revelation that God gave man. But subjectively, schism is worse. And the reason is that even the heretic believes he's doing what he's doing for the sake of God's truth. Whereas with schism, either or usually both sides are all about them. I'm in charge, me, you betcha. And as the Patriarch pointed out, and I thought very well, the schism is like a divorce. And divorces are inevitably the result of human sin and pride on both sides. He says, union between the two will not come about through simply signing accords and that kind of thing. It will come about when both sides see and accept and feel this schism for what it is. A sin and a loss and a horror. As long as we feel we can do without the other, it won't matter. As you put it, the guys who go out hunting, the women who go gardening, the Ents and the Entwives, for all of you Tolkien-minded people. And is that what God wants? Was his prayer that all be one, meaning let's make sure they break up and hate each other's stinking guts? That doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard. What is certainly true, too, is that pride, given what both sides have gone through these past several decades, is something that we should banish forever. We Westerners have shown, we Latin Catholics, have shown that we're quite capable of being ridiculous, of forsaking everything that we've been handed down. But the Orthodox have shown in their way the same sort of thing. And you would think that between the communists and the Turks for them, and the modernists for us, we would realize that the pride that keeps us apart is from the devil. But since it fills our pride, we don't. We don't need you guys, you don't need us. And having said that, Doc, unless you've got anything to add, why don't we go to questions and answers?
Let me just add one more thing, and then we'll go to this gentleman here because I saw his hand first.
We're not going to tell you nothing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
And I think this is exactly right because just to piggyback on what you said about when both sides feel that that feel within their very being, within the very fiber of their being, that this schism is wrong. We're always, until that happens, that's, we're not going to get anywhere. Because it's not enough for bishops up here to sign documents, right? It's not enough. It's not enough for people to have these nice little get-togethers and
in clubs,
and so forth, because until the average Greek the average. Well, once
You can say Irish one.
once they re-embrace the Catholic faith, then I can say this: the average Irishman, the average Italian, the average Russian, until they come to see each other as some, until they start feeling that absence of each other as a sin, and knowing it for such. Then I think reunion will be only a nice little thing that happens between bishops on both sides with tea and crumpets. What does that mean for both sides? Basically, what it means is that, well, on the Latin side, the Latin Church has to get its liturgical act together, right? I cannot say this more firmly, because that tells the Orthodox that the Latins are serious about the worship of the true God and how liturgy must be something that basically brings us into a communion with God. And that has to be reflected in our hymnography and in our music, in the whole spectrum of the worship that constitutes the Mass, right? A sense of mystery has to be recaptured, and I think a lot of improvement has been. There's been a lot of improvement in the last 20 years or so, but there's still a lot to be done.
God knows.
There's still a great deal to be done there. Because it's not enough to have committees that where we attempt to finesse the filioque. When our worship, when worship is just absolute. Right, when it's just I couldn't find another word, so it's just onomatopoeia is the best thing.
Yeah,
maybe that too.
Pretty much. Yeah.
It's not. It really isn't enough, right? It's not good enough.
We'll never impress the Orthodox by becoming Protestant.
No, you will never impress the Orthodox with on eagle's wings. Sorry if you like that. I'm sorry, but. There's something about Gregorian chant, Byzantine chant, and all these other, the great historical patrimony of the Church's hymnography, all of them, whether it's Chaldean, Maronite, Byzantine, Gregorian, whatever, Armenian. There's a beauty about it, but it's not a sentimental beauty, right? There's nothing saccharine or sentimental about it. It's a beauty. It's a kind of beauty that fills us with awe, that invites us, but also fills us with awe, much like a picture of the galaxy, right? And the vastness of space, right? That's the kind of sense of the mysterium, what the German theologian Rudolf Otto called the mysterium tremendum. The tremendous mystery that we need to recapture, that Catholics need to recapture in our worship. Now, on the Orthodox side, it becomes a question of what precisely is authority, right? What in a reunified church, what would that unity look like? What would that authority look like? What binds the churches together? Now, the answers might be the Eucharist. There's such a thing as Eucharistic ecclesiology, right? But so each church that celebrates the Eucharist is a complete church in communion with other churches that celebrate the mysteries. But how, like the Greek theologian, Metropolitan John Zizioulas put it, the question he asks is, how does that how does that explain the unity between all these churches, right? What binds them together? What is it that, because if each church celebrating the Eucharist is its own church, right, is its own complete unity, then in what sense is the church one? So, and on top of that, what does authority, what does first among equals even mean, right? Does it mean that the ecumenical patriarch just gets a nicer seat? Is there anything involved in that office that might make that might unify the churches? These are questions that we still need to ask. On the Orthodox side, on the Catholic side, and on the Orthodox side too. I guess since we have a Western Rite Orthodox priest here, I think you'll appreciate this. Being comfortable too with a variety of liturgies, right? Of ancient liturgies, being a family. This concept of, you can't really absolutize one rite over all the others.
And that, if I'll just interject, was always our great sin.
That's yes. In the Catholic Church, that was on the Latin side. You see some instances of this, and on the so I think that is something we need to work on. Those are questions I think we need to work on. But again, until all of us, Orthodox and Catholic, really feel that the schism, that the way things are, and we feel it in our gut, that it is and we know it to be a grave sin, then until that day comes, I think when that happens, and notice I'm saying when that happens, I'm an eternal optimist, then you'll start seeing bridges mending.
I agree, and I'll just add, and then we'll get your question. The sad truth of the matter, ladies and gentlemen, is that we often, Catholic and Orthodox alike, are very proud of the fact that we have the sacraments. We're baptized into Christ. We receive His body and blood. We get our sins absolved. That's wonderful. What we forget is that those gifts also carry with them an obligation. And that obligation, trite as it sounds, is amongst other things to love one another as He has loved us. And we don't. And that's obviously true just in everyday life. Mother liked my brother better than me. No. But it is particularly true here. Remember I mentioned way back earlier on that the First Crusade was the most successful of them because despite various things, that was the time, only one of the Crusades where the two sides were more or less on the up and up with each other. Down through history, when East and West have truly collaborated, and there have been times when it's happened, their efforts, whether they be peaceful or defensive, have met with success. But when, as more often happens, they stab one another in the back, they have met deservedly with failure. So, having said that, what do you want to know, sir?
Yes, I just want to say thank you very much for taking the time to talk about all this. I really love what you had to say about the liturgy of the church, in the Latin Rite today. I'm relatively new Catholic. I became Catholic last year. I was non-denominational Protestant most of my life. And so I came to the church kicking and screaming because of the Mass. Yes. Oftentimes I went to Mass and thought this is honestly the most boring, awful thing I've ever seen. And if it wasn't for the Eucharist and the Sacraments, I would have never entered the church. Sure. So, what can we do, besides just stepping into these roles to help, become a liturgist or something? What can we do on a larger scale to make effectual change on a massive scale? And also, your point about how the church in the Latin Rite has used sort of used authority and allowed for all these sort of liturgical changes, or as Peter Craig puts it, a liturgical holocaust.
Yeah.
How, if that's what sort of that loosey-goosey authority has sort of allowed in the Eastern, I'm very new to the church, so I don't know if I'm using the right term, but in the Eastern rites, are there, in the tradition that they're kind of stuck in that tradition, seems to me like, from what I don't know a lot, I don't know about history, but it seems to me like it's held like a far deeper beauty and
Sure.
a deeper tradition, and not allowed for some of these liturgical abuses that we see in most order today.
Right,
most of
right,
the
right.
parishes around.
You want to take this one or
Sure.
first, and I'll piggyback. And then I
Then you
can,
can show them where I'm wrong. Okay. Well, firstly, number one, you're right, if that's any help. Two, speaking as one who lived through the changes and so forth, and also speaking as an historian, it's important to bear in mind that in, with, and under everything we see around us, it's not simply the working out of human wills. God and the devil are always at war, and we collaborate with both sides to a greater or lesser degree. I'm just saying that because we tend to forget there's a transcendent element to everything we do. Now, it's true that the vast majority of masses you go to today, certainly around here, are pretty bad. I'm a daily communicant, I know. But you do have alternatives. There certainly is the Latin Mass. I don't want to advertise too blatantly, but there's Our Lady of Grace meeting every Sunday at LaSalle High School at 6 p.m. What's that? Ordinariate, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, was that a plug? Oh, I'm sorry. And there are, like St. Therese also, there are also those sort of parishes that are sort of stumbling their way back. And truly, the situation, you'll find this hard to believe, is tons better now than when I was your age. That's hard to believe, but I remember a day when the most popular processional hymn in this archdiocese was "Put Your Hand in the Hand of the Man." You don't know what you ain't missed. But having said that, a lot depends on you. What is it you want to do? For instance, do you have a vocation of the priesthood? If you have a vocation of the lay life, then I would say find a parish that works and get involved with it. Or, contrary-wise, if you're in a parish that's particularly bad, but you have a lot of friends and you're active in it, see about see about humbly requesting something better. But of course, to do that, you've got to know what you're talking about. And that comes to education. So, as we said at the School of Lower Learning that I attended, so I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that from their side, their problems and their sins are not ours. They have their own, which, believe me, you would find quite as annoying, only for different reasons. Just as you yourself have temptations and this sort of thing that your friends don't have, and vice versa. It's the same thing. You know, this one is tempted to steal. That one is tempted to, trip people when they're walking. But some of us are tempted to both, it's true. But that's the thing you got to bear in mind. And having had a wide range of friends on both sides, I know that the liturgy is not the only aspect of life. For us, it's where we've screwed up. For the East, it's authority. And they have to settle their problem the way we have to settle ours. I mean, a few years ago, there was a big to-do in the Orthodox world over the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. There was one chap who was elected Patriarch of Jerusalem. He got into a tussle with the Israeli government, which is never smart, just so you'll know. He ended up out. There was this big split in the Patriarchate. And then the different Orthodox churches took up sides. It was jumping up and down.
Patriarch Irenaeus.
That was the one. And I think he still claims to be Patriarch. So that got tamped down, as these things usually do. But the point I'm making is that if you had to live through that, you'd find it quite as annoying as what we go through. Similarly, another thing that always gets people going in the Eastern world is jurisdiction over places like the Ukraine and Estonia and so on. And then in this country, I mean, we've got gentlemen here from the OCA. OCA was originally a Russian-derived Orthodox body. And there was a time when they had hoped to succeed that united Russian Orthodox control. But the other Orthodox bodies wouldn't have anything of it. And I remember in the 70s, it got pretty unpleasant. The sad truth is, wherever you go, you're going to have to deal with fallen nature. And it will express itself however it can. If it doesn't express itself liturgically, it'll do it jurisdictionally. If it can't do it either way, it'll come up with something you haven't heard of yet. But it will. So that's the best I can do you for. Got anything to add, Prof?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that pretty much explains it all. And in terms of what you can do, I think he mentioned, if there are a significant amount of like-minded friends in a bad parish, right? Maybe humbly requesting something better. And I have an example of a priest who a young priest actually at a parish in Houston where I live and work now, where things are slowly turning around, but very slowly though. But it all began with a lot of young, like-minded young people like yourself who went to the priest. Now, they had to be very tactful about it, because if they had said, "Father, we want you to celebrate a full Tridentine Mass in Latin, with Gregorian chant, watch a head explode and venom spew all over the place," right? But no, he said, we kind of like Gregorian chant a little bit. Now we'd like to do it in English, of course, but I'm wondering if we could have a full kind of, and again in the ordinary rite, maybe a nice little a mass with full Gregorian chant, and a number of us could actually sing, have a nice. And the priest kind of thought about it. He said, "Sure, okay." And there was a young priest that was more than willing to do it. And he said, "Absolutely, go ahead."
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think things began to kind of slowly doing things like that. Also supporting, and this is very important, supporting congregations and orders and other bodies where the Catholic faith is taught and practiced in all of will become very important too, with supporting it with prayer and with coin, right? With treasury, putting your money where your mouth is. Right, that's an important thing.
One other quick point there, and that is that a large part of the problem in the church today is not really, as some fear, an incipient schism, but a generation gap.
Yeah.
And very often, younger priests will come to parishes primarily run by, I hate the phrase, blue-headed people. They'll try to re-Catholicize the place. And you can't do that. Why, those guitars are the songs of my childhood. You can't do that. And so if you find yourself in a position where your new pastor is facing opposition, you got to support him, because it's hell. Those blue heads, they get wild. Woodstock is over. Sorry.
Sir, I'm also a convert as well to the faith. And when I converted, it was in the traditional rite of Mass as well. We just watched my catechism. It's got pictures, it's the best. The thing is that one thing that I've seen, especially coming from, I was in an oddly kind of Protestant, charismatic Protestant, Pentecostal, Southern Baptist, the way they were wrong and all this stuff.
Sure.
And it was very illogical, in the end. And what had happened was, when I when I converted to the faith, I just became a devout Trinity Mass person. And so I remember one time I was in a different state, and I had to go to I went to Catholic school, middle school, and honestly, it felt more Protestant than Catholic.
Sure.
You know, they had screens, and guitars, and bands, altar girl boys.
Altar girl boys. That's the next step, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Well, the Anglicans are already there.
Anglicans are.
Yeah, Anglicans are already there. Thanks. You were saying.
I actually did some research about how even in the Catholic Church, how women are saying, how not only do you see feminism have increased in the Catholic Church, also the accepting of homosexual acts and stuff like that, but also you see that women want to become priestess, and the Episcopalians already started that, you know, and so you see a lot of people leaving the Catholic Church for that because of that, being priestess, and why do you think? And my question is this: why do you think that priests? Do you think maybe a lack of fortitude that priests don't talk about the liturgical duties? Because I'm sure they are well aware of what the liturgy is and how it's supposed to be celebrated, both in the new rite and the old rite. Most of them are in the new rite, and I'm sure it is probably seminaries as far as how they are supposed to be celebrated.
Some seminaries.
Some seminaries are all I see. So as far as Adoratum versus Coulombe goes,
It's a different story.
Okay.
Well, firstly, you have to bear in mind that every diocese is a different world. Remember what I said earlier about how in my time the bishops ran their own show? They do, right. And they did.
Right.
Like if you went now to the Archdiocese of New York where I was born, I'm sorry, I was absorbed in memory. The seminary at Dunwoody teaches the Tridentine Mass. And most of the kids who are graduating from there now, well, they say both Masses, but their first Mass will tend, it's their own choice, but it'll tend to be the Tridentine Mass. Why? Because they're exposed to both. But even their Novus Ordo Masses are better. Right. Similarly, in churches, and I've seen this around the country, in churches that offer the Tridentine Mass as well, usually the Novus Ordo is celebrated in a much better fashion than it is in places. Exactly. Because you just get used to doing things in a proper manner. And it is getting better, despite the best efforts of the elderly. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I don't want to sound like an ageist here. And at 56, it's hard for me to sound like an ageist. But what's important for you to bear in mind is that really, I would have to say, is the liturgical problem in the church, and here I'm actually quoting Pope Benedict XVI, is actually secondary to a major problem of which it's really a symptom. The symptom is that we no longer believe in the church as the means of salvation. This is not a problem the Orthodox have, at least in theory. I say in theory because, and again, there's nothing you can say about the Orthodox that covers all Orthodox. I want to make that really clear. But the evangelistic, the missionary impulse is tied directly to how truly you feel the sacraments are necessary for salvation. If they're not, then why are you bothering people? Leave them alone. But, and again, I'm quoting Pope Benedict. That takes, if you say that, that's fine, but it takes away A, the need to evangelize, and B, the need to stay in the church, the practicing it at all. What we have lost is the idea of the salvation of souls. At the end of the day, and we tend to forget, too, that we are responsible for the salvation of souls. We ourselves, as individuals, we're like the Good Samaritan. We've all heard it, that if you see somebody lying there on the street like the Good Samaritan, we have an obligation of Christians to take care of him. That's true physically, but it's true spiritually. We, each of us, are able to go places that no priest will ever go. And it's up to us to bring the faith to those places. Even rectories. That came out wrong, never mind. But seriously, as to whether they know better, yeah, they know better, but in dioceses where the bishop is not particularly Catholic-minded, it's their careers at stake. And unless they absolutely positively believe that what they're doing is absolutely essential for souls, my job, my convenience versus what? So, but I believe, again, this is a problem that is slowly fixing itself with time. I mean, honestly, what always amazes me, like in this archdiocese, is to hear some of the seminarians talk, how solid they are. And it's a native solidness. It's not anything they picked up in school. Because, again, there's the transcendent element. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. And that's important to bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Unity will come, whether it's because of us or despite us. That's another story. But I hope that helps.
And there's a gentleman there that in the back who I just saw.
But there's this gentleman here who's.
Oh, was he first? Who was first?
This
Who's on
gentleman,
first?
This gentleman, you.
Rock, paper, scissors.
So, getting back to the ecclesiastical questions, one problem that I thought maybe could be addressed by both of you. In Vatican Council I, there was a definite rule by the commoners to consolidate the papacy. So the infallibility doctrine is specified and the doctrinal issues with that arose out of that. As a corrective, in Second Vatican II, and according to Pope Benedict, who played a role in it, a corrective needed to be done in Vatican II, and that was to reintroduce the concept of collegiality among the bishops in particular. So a great portion of Vatican II doctrine connected with or dedicated to the relationship of the bishops with each other. And out of that, looking at the East, was introduced by Pope Paul VI, the concept of synods, the synod of bishops, which had not been done before this time. And out of that came out the notion of national conferences of bishops.
Yeah.
So there seems to have been a movement from a solidifying to more of an Eastern mindset of this communion of bishops, one with Rome. Now, I'm not too familiar with Eastern history, but to my understanding, maybe you can correct me on this. I find it a little bit ironic that in the Eastern traditions, there hasn't been this sense of collegiality. There has mentioned, there's always these question of authorities. And so maybe the dialogue between East and West should be more of one doing with, I can see the difficulty. In the West, you do have a certain one voice, even though there's a collegiality element introduced to it. But in the East, who exactly would the West speak to?
That is the problem.
That's the question. And we could, we have a priest
that
here.
That is an issue. And even though in the East, and I'm sorry, I was raised in Latin Mass, but I don't care for it. To me,
No, it's all right. It says hello. Don't worry.
it says a lot, but I do have friends who are by ritual and things of that nature. As you mentioned, that it is the liturgy that provides the unity.
Yeah.
No, you don't see that in the East. Obviously, there is no fruit to that proposition. There seems to be collegiality that bears more fruit.
I'm going to ask Father to answer an aspect of your question, but before I do, let me just say 3 quick points. One is, Cardinal Ottaviani had a wonderful point about collegiality. He was asked if he saw any example of collegiality in the scriptures, and he pointed to the first collegiate act of the church hierarchy, and they all fled. That's in the garden for those of you who are Maundy Thursday fans. That was the first, the only example in scriptures, and they all fled. You know, similarly, the first 3 acts of the first pope was to deny our Lord 3 times. But you know what happens to people who try to critique jokes They get tossed out. No, but no, seriously, the thing is that the problem with the whole notion of collegiality, I think, and the reason why it's been difficult to think, is that it's, in a sense, a new creation. In other words, theologians have wrestled with how to express the relationship between the unity of the Holy See and the bishops in the various churches. The national hierarchies, as expressed through these national conferences, Pope Benedict pointed out, do not have the same foundation or the same standing as individual bishops. In the Middle Ages, most countries had primates who were the heads of their respective national churches. But again, it wasn't an apostolic foundation. I honestly feel that the relationship of the Holy See to individual dioceses is not something that will ever be completely smooth. Because like the relationship between men and women, like the relationship between the clergy and the laity, like so many things in the life of the church, you have two things that are, but will always be sources of conflict.
But I gather that we have to assume that they do not have to be, nor are they called to be. Just like in a marriage, it's neither the husband or not the wife, it is a communion. Collegiality only works if you have this sense of communion.
Exactly. Exactly right.
So the tension between bishops and Rome, I think, is a healthy tension.
It can be.
It is part of the dynamics of the Spirit working through the church.
It can be, and mutatis mutandis, it's rather like in the Middle Ages, Thomism was not the only school.
Right.
You had a number of others, the Augustinians and the Scotus and so on and so forth. And in the greatest days of medieval scholasticism, each of these schools acted as correctives on the others. And that is, as advanced earlier, I think, is the proper relationship between East and West. But having said that, Father, where's the spotlight? Turn that on him.
One of the challenges begins with the way we set up history. And we set up history as a great schism, or acism, between Rome and Orthodoxy. When actually the schism was between Rome and Constantinople. Right. And Rome and Antioch did not secede or have a schism until the 1700s.
That's correct.
Rome and Alexandria did not have a schism because Alexandria was overrun. Rome and Jerusalem don't. So that's part of the challenge in talking to the Orthodox is remembering and it irritated some Orthodox to hear this, but I think it's true when Cardinal Casper, I think it was Cardinal Casper, said it's Eastern churches, not the Eastern Church. When you hear of the Latin Church or the Roman Catholic Church, you hear of a monarchy, and if there's a synod of bishops, it's like the monarch meeting with his barons.
No.
Right.
When you hear of the Orthodox Church, you should hear of something that approaches the ideal confederate union of the United States. Something that is not even like governors talking together with the president, but rather something that is like several different autonomous or autocephalous groups that are related to each other by communion, but are running their own show very differently.
Like the Commonwealth.
Yes, exactly. When I taught at Catholic high school as an Orthodox priest, and the students would ask me, so how does it work with you? Who's your pope? I said, we have 15 popes. That's how it works. And my particular pope happens to be in Antioch, but my particular pope is not my pope. So to illustrate that, and I had to illustrate this for the high school students because they were baffled by all this. To illustrate that, I told them about the time that I was invited as an Orthodox priest to be an observer at the instituting of the Archbishop of Detroit. The Bishop of Oakland, Alan Dickeron, was appointed as Archbishop of Detroit. I went to the service, it was a very grand affair. And there was one point where the papal nuncio stood up and read in Latin and English that Pope Benedict was appointing Alan Dickeron as the Archbishop of Detroit. A year later, we elected a bishop for our jurisdiction. The bishops in the area elected that bishop.
Right.
The patriarch in Antioch, for us, had no say on that. He could have confirmed it, he could have denied it, he could have ignored it, he could have done anything, and it would not have mattered, because that was going to be our bishop for that area. Now, as a matter of course, as a matter of courtesy, as a matter of primacy and honor, the bishop was taken over to Syria, was made a bishop, was consecrated bishop there in Syria. And he has a relationship with the patriarch for that reason. But it didn't have to be that way. And that's something that's hard for us sometimes to wrap our minds around. To give you another example, if the patriarch, my patriarch, comes walking in my parish, he can do nothing unless I have a letter from my bishop saying he can serve.
Yes.
It's a very different system. And because of that, it works out a very different way, but also because of that, liturgy is exceedingly important. So much so that that is what holds us all together. Right.
No. And that it's also in that sense similar to what the Anglican Communion was once. The difference is that it hasn't fallen to bits in Orthodoxy, and that it's a
self-policing action. I mean, I could probably go on for a long time. There's a self-policing action that happens. There's national things that are at play. There's political things that are at play. This is the reason why Rome talks to Russia and Rome talks to Greece. But Russia and Greece don't talk to each other.
no, which oddly enough is kind of a prefiguring of something or other, maybe, if they could just get them all together. All right, the long-standing and long-suffering.
No worries. Two things. One that's just a quick comment. You talked about how the two seem to balance each other or will or
should. Ideally.
Should.
Ideally.
It reminds me of, and this is just a statement, it reminds me of the Christological constellation, which if you don't know what that is, there's another 45 minutes of discussion we won't get into. But my question is, because you joked about it minorly, however, for most of the less educated laity, the filioque controversy tends to be the thing people focus on.
Yes.
And you joked about it, that it has to come after some other things. However, it does exist.
It does.
So, in your opinions, where does that conversation go? How does that conversation go when we get to that conversation?
Come back in 2 weeks or no? Well, if I'll toss something quick, and then the doc will give you something useful.
I don't know. We'll be here a week.
Yeah, well, let me put it this way. While running around online one time, I found the proceedings of a Catholic Orthodox conference on the filioque. And I tried to read the papers. Now, contrary to what you may decide from looking at me, I'm not that stupid. But it was very difficult for me to wrap my head around a lot of the presentations, because what each of the different presenters were doing, and they were Catholic and they were Orthodox, were about the deep significance of the filioque. And I looked through it, and I mean, I could follow it to a degree. I'm not talking now about the historical element, which I understand perfectly. I'm talking about the theological and philosophical results of denying or accepting filioque. So, I mean, by the time I was done, I knew less than I started with. So, a Russian Orthodox friend of mine in England and I were chatting, and I mentioned that I'd been to a Russian Rite church here in El Segundo, Russian Catholic. It was the very same. And he said, and he goes, well, what's that liturgy like? And I said, well, to tell you the truth, it's just like yours. He said, well, I suppose they use the filioque. I said, no, our Eastern rites don't have to use the filioque liturgically. He says, well, that doesn't bother you. I said, yeah. And he says, so you wouldn't mind giving it up? I said, well, no, I can't say that because there are tremendous implications. And he said, well, what are they? I'll take care of you, I said. I sent him the proceedings that I had read. He sent me back a one-sentence response. Ow, my head hurts. Now, I mention this because, in truth, this is precisely the kind of question that the hierarchy of the church must settle, that really is beyond us. Frankly, when it comes to Catholic Orthodox disputation, these and various other questions have been used as hammers to hit one another with, rather than as attempts to find truth. I suspect that if we begin, as the Patriarch of Moscow suggested, to look at each other and to look at this as a sin that has to be overcome, I have no doubt a means will be found. But it is one of the problems we have living as 21st century people is that we think that everything can be solved immediately and that we have a right to solve it ourselves. But one of the best illustrations, I think, of reality was the solution of the great Jesuit Dominican fight over grace versus free will. It got so heated that they began calling each other heretics. They both appealed to the Pope of the day, and he said, "Shut up." He silenced them both. And they are not allowed to dispute on grace versus free will. By the way, you know it talks really bad when one of the speakers walks off, just so you'll know. It's just like, when you're speaking and you see members of the audience fall asleep. That's bad when the speaker passes out. All right, anyway, so to answer your question then, since he's gone, so he won't help me, I don't think it is really the issue. It's certainly been used. But I think back, for instance, to the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which very few, if any, Orthodox theologians disputed until we defined it. The cathedral in Moscow was named after the Assumption. So, believe me, I hate to sound like a 60s person, but bring the love first. All right, any other questions? Go. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah. So a lot of your talks seem to focus on kind of like the large scale macro issues, but I'm wondering, like, on an individual one-to-one scale, what can I tell? Because I have friends who have recently converted to evangelical friends who have recently converted to Eastern Orthodoxy and make handographs kind of around Eastern Orthodoxy. So what can I tell my friends, or what kind of conversations can I have with them to bring them over? And even that seems kind of problematic, because a lot of the Catholics that I've talked to have a really great hesitancy in trying to evangelize the Orthodox. So what can you say about all of that?
Well, that's a very good question. And the question is, what does one do on the local scale? Oh, thank you. You desert me when I was asked a question I had no answer to.
Dry.
I looked like a fool and you left me. Fine.
Feeling a little dry.
Yeah, well, no, I'm joking. Anyway, so it was good. You weren't missed. Don't worry. Anyway.
Thanks.
No,
I have something to
seriously.
say about the filioque too. But anyway, go ahead.
Seriously, the first thing you got to bear in mind is that as Catholics, and Pace Padrissime, as Catholics, we obviously believe that our faith is the totality of the whole truth. But the Orthodox are a different matter from the Protestants. One of the things you'll find is the converts to Orthodoxy tend to be more anti-Catholic than Great Orthodox. That's a reality. And that's just the way it is. And in fact, Great Orthodox, again, Pace Padrissime, have an unkind phrase for converts to Orthodoxy. They call them envelopes. Meaning they look Orthodox on the outside, but on the inside, no. It's a Russian thing, probably.
They're on their way.
But having said all of that, I think the first thing that you have to do when you're dealing with Orthodox is emphasize your respect for them as sister churches. And again, I'm from Pope Benedict. They have the same apostolic succession we do. If they're anti-papal, you've got to work on them. Because they, according to the most savagely anti-Roman Russian theologians of the 19th century, you can't define anything without an ecumenical council. But at the same time, they held you can't have an ecumenical council without the Pope. That's Orthodox people, not Catholic. So that's the kind of thing. But above all, to the degree that you can do things with them, I'm thinking of venerations of common saints, venerations of Our Lady, anything and everything we have in common with them. Push it. Have a St. Nicholas Day party.
Yes.
You know, he's one of the St. Nicholas is one of the biggest saints common to both of us. Look around for whatever will bring people together in this area and not divide them. And then, you know, they say insulting things, smile and come up with something as bad. You know, all right, I'm not a nice person, I'm French Canadian, we don't have to be nice. But seriously, so that's my advice. Oh, and the other thing I would suggest you do, and this is true, by the way, any Latins in the room, go to as many Eastern Rite Catholic liturgies as you can. Very important, because it's important for us to develop within ourselves a sort of pan-Catholic mentality.
Yes.
I mean, it may seem strange, it may seem foreign, but they're as Catholic as we are, and more sometimes. Father.
May I add a little bit from Roman canon law? I was able, as an Orthodox priest, to teach theology at a Catholic high school, because according to Roman Catholic canon law, I'm in communion with the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
So what are you converting them to?
Right.
yeah. That's why, for instance, when the doc became a Catholic, he wasn't converted per se.
Right.
He wasn't received in the same way that
Right, so maybe not conversion, but correcting.
it's fulfilling. I don't know. Anyway, whatever you call it, I offered to be his godfather, and he said, "I don't need you, stinking Latin." It sounded friendly enough. Anyway, so keep that in mind, and also there was something else I want to touch on, but it's gotten out of my head.
But I think the point of attending as many Eastern Rite Catholic liturgies as possible, I think, is important. And maybe one Sunday, maybe visit an Orthodox parish.
And absolutely, now I remember what I wanted to say. Thank you. Canon 844 allows us, and they'll allow us to receive from the Orthodox, but it's whether or not they'll allow us to.
Well, it also means that you need to have an obligation like going to the Orthodox Church.
Yes, you do. Even if you don't receive, you do fulfill your Sunday obligation by going to the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, that's right.
And more than that, they, as far as we're concerned, fulfill theirs. Now, I had a very good friend, again, in St. Andrews, Father Theodore Wilcock, who was the pastor there in St. Andrews. And he had no trouble giving communion to people he knew were Orthodox, because the very fact that they would come to a priest whom they knew were Catholic showed that they were not systematically minded. And again, when, at the Requiem for my dad, a Russian Orthodox friend of mine, who's Rokor actually, and they're not you OCA people, Rokor, Russian.
That's the T part.
Exactly. So he says to me beforehand, he goes, Charles, would it be all right that I receive communion? And I looked at him and I said, well, it would be as far as we're concerned, but your bishop would consider it an act of schism and possibly heresy. And he says, if you don't tell him, I won't. I didn't, by the way. So, I mean, it's this weird kind of murky area, but again, the more you do it, the more you explore the East, the more you begin to see them as an integral part of ourselves, a part of our family.
Yes. And I would say the Byzantine Rite within the Catholic Church, Byzantine Rite, visiting an Orthodox parish once in a while, and then visiting maybe a Chaldean Rite, the Coptic Rite, the Maronites, Malabar, all of
Catholic
these.
Armenians. We have in this archdiocese,
Yeah.
we literally have churches of every single Eastern Catholic rite.
Yeah. And really develop this, in an effort to really develop this pan-Catholic understanding, right? And I think that will prepare you well in many ways to really talk to your, when you talk to your Orthodox friends. and really understand where they're coming from, and vice versa. Where, if you invite your Orthodox friend to maybe a Latin Mass or a
baptism
or a baptism or whatever, it'll expand his or her horizons.
And that's where we begin to feel the hurt.
Yeah,
Exactly.
just so.
That'll make it real.
That'll
There's-
make it real.
There's also one other benefit about going to Eastern Rite churches I have to point out, and that is usually they are really happy to see Westerners. Mm-hmm. And what will happen is that an old lady with a thick accent
Yes.
will take you in hand, and they're not this lousy coffee and donut stuff that we do. If we even do that.
No.
They bring out all these weird ethnic foods, and they drag you over.
It's
and
also
sit you
called
down.
delicious.
Oh gosh, you'll come waddling out of there. Anyway, so
I think he has.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
just something that I've always been curious about. Not really sure if my sources are right, but I saw this on YouTube. So.
Oh, it's true. Wikipedia, source of all truth. Yeah, I know.
But leavened and unleavened bread, as far as the Eucharist, I heard that was a big deal, like in the 10th century. Yeah. How big is that now? And like, is that even important nowadays? Like, just curious.
Among the Orthodox, it will depend on who you talk to. Now, for the most part, in Orthodoxy, it's not really been and you may speak to this, Father, or our OCA friend here. Well, who knows? Who knows?
There's a Rocor hitman waiting for you right
That's
outside.
right.
You're toast when you leave here.
A big hefty Russian waiting for you. But anyway, as far as I know, that has not been a major issue in a lot of the talks between theologians on
Not on that level.
Not on that level, yeah.
But if I serve unleavened bread, my bishop would
Probably put you on a spit and fry it, yeah.
on the local level, it's a key determinant.
It's a key determinant on the local level. It's and that's simply because that is part of canon law. That is part of Byzantine canon law. That
Is there significance to that?
There is, but it's one of the things you find is in the different approaches to symbolism that the East and West have. If you take away, shall we say, prejudices and using them as clubs to smack each other with, they tend to come to very similar meanings. The leavening, as I understand it, refers to the action of the Holy Ghost. And it's a beautiful symbol. The Assyrian church not only used leavened bread, you have to use a particular yeast, which they claim comes down to them all the way from the beginning. With us, we use unleavened bread partly as a memento of our Jewish origins.
But Pope Benedict points out that Jesus used leavened bread.
Yeah,
In his I think it's volume 2 of Jesus and
he does. You see these different symbolisms get attached. I mean, similarly, as you know, or maybe you don't, the Byzantines, both Catholic and Orthodox, do not have our All Souls Day. Instead, they've got several Saturdays during the year, the biggest of which is the day before Pentecost, on which they commemorate all the departed.
it's called Soul Saturday.
Yeah, but it's a different way of doing the same thing. But you see, you can do this in two different ways. You can say, they commemorate all the departed on those Soul Saturdays. We do it on All Souls Day. Or you can say, you see the difference? These abominable Greeks, they dare to celebrate the departed on Saturdays, whereas we, holders of the pure faith, will only do it on the 2nd of November, or vice versa. And then I should say also here, this is just pops in my head. I've read a lot of Orthodox controversial literature against the church, and so often I find myself, I'll read, the writer says, so the Catholics believe this and such. I go, yeah, we do. And then we Orthodox believe this. Yeah. So you see the difference.
Okay.
So I know this night is focused on the communion of Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Church, but perhaps the dogs can pick up some crumbs from the master's table. The dogs being Protestants, and beg for your input, just in brief, on what your opinion is on how Protestants, and let's go to the perhaps the most difficult side of Protestants, those non-denominational evangelical Protestants. In what ways can we best productively join this conversation? And is there any place, in your opinion, for the Protestant churches to contribute something to that balance that you guys were discussing earlier in terms of what we can learn from each other? Clearly, there's plenty to be learned by the Protestant church from you guys, obviously, but would you give any credence to that balance being something we can contribute to as well? And what can we do to provide to that conversation?
If I can take this part, this one, because I've been through, I was born in Havana. Now that should tell you that I probably should have been a uber Catholic, right? But no, I was a Baptist. A Cuban Baptist, I know, that's, that blows everybody's, but one thing that I carry from that experience, and I knew from a very earliest childhood, I've always remembered having a deep and sincere love of the Scriptures. The Scriptures, I just couldn't get enough of them. As soon as I could read, I remember just imbibing the Scriptures. I would, there was, and especially in Spanish, the Bibles that were then current, the translation that was then current was the Reina Valera version. Now, Reina Valera, Casiodoro de Reina was a Spanish Protestant who actually translated the Bible, and that for a lot of Spanish-speaking Protestants, that for a long time was the standard translation of the Bible that was used. And it was sort of the Spanish-speaking version of the King James. So as soon as I heard the King James read, I said, I need to get my hands on a King James Bible. I was about 8 or 9 years old. And I asked my mother, for that as a birthday gift. Now, for birthday gifts, you can think of a lot of different things that you might have wanted, but a King James Bible was probably not high on your list in terms of it. But I really wanted a King James Bible because I loved the turns of phrases, right? The beautiful, and I memorized a great deal, from the Scriptures, from the Bible. So to me, the love of the Scriptures is something that I carry with me as a gift, right? As a gift that I and that I cherish. I mean, even now, even as I through the ordinariates, I follow the ordinariate. So I have a Book of Common Prayer that I follow, and actually it's from the Western Rite Vicariate, the book, I still use that as part of my prayer from St. Lancelot Andrews Press, the Book of Common Prayer with its readings, and I just can't wait to get to the Scripture readings, right? Whenever I get to this, because there's so much Scripture, and the very order of the liturgy of the liturgy of the hours, right, is so infused with Scripture. The Mass itself is infused with Scripture, right? The liturgy has lots of Scripture. We pray the Scriptures. So I think in terms of what Protestants could bring to the table, is this love of the Scriptures, but the Scriptures have to be set in a broader context, right? Because from the earliest days of the Church, how have the Scriptures been used? They haven't been used to, hit each other, on the head with Bible verses, right? It was, and there was no such thing as one singular, tome called the Holy Bible, King James Version. I don't know.
I heard an old fellow say to me once that the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus Christ. It was good enough for him.
Jesus Christ, good enough for me, right? But I learned later on, that the Bible came within context. It came, within the worship of the church. It was used. It's an ecclesial context, right? But nonetheless, that love of the Scriptures is something that I got from my Baptist background, right? So that's my personal reflection on that.
I would just add that one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that at the time of the Reformation, and again, it varied from whether it was Anglican, Lutheran, or Reformed, there was a more or less re-Old Testamentization, if you will. The loss of the concept of the sacrifice, the priesthood, the sacraments, all that went out the window, more with the Reformed tradition, which is the biggest thing in the United States. It was somewhat retained in kind of an odd way by the Lutherans, a good deal more by the Anglicans. I think primarily what each Protestant has to ask himself, because, at the end of the day, how do you define Protestant? And the answer is it's not Catholic or Orthodox. So what that means is that every single Protestant at the end of the day is forced to be his own authority. Now, when you have converts, including even the guy next to me, they give up the belief that that's it. I am my own man, because they don't feel it's scriptural. They don't feel it's historical. And then what the Protestant is faced with really is determining his own reality to get New Agey on him. It's a very hard thing, and of course there are Protestants. For the Catholic, it's hard to kind of grasp this, because we're very clear what is Catholic, we're very clear what is Protestant. We're not, but we're clear what's Orthodox. But you'll hear someone say, yeah, I was raised Methodist, but then we moved, so we were Presbyterian, because there was this Presbyterian church. Then I went to this Baptist Sunday school. By the time they're done, you look at it and say, well, which of it did you believe? But they don't look at it the way we do, and even that question does not mean for the Protestant what it means for us. Have you ever heard of the Marble Collegiate Church in New York City? Well, there was once a minister in this land called Norman Vincent Peale. Norman Vincent Peale was the author of what was called the Prosperity Gospel, which I myself wish I had a deal with. But anyway, that's a whole other story. At any rate, Marble Collegiate Church, that's their big shtick, is that they were Norman Vincent Peale's church. They are legally, if you will, Dutch Reformed. So I happened to be there. I asked the minister, I said, well, what's your standard of belief? He says, well, it's supposed to be the Heidelberg Catechism and the Synod of Dort. I don't think anybody in this church has ever heard of those things. I didn't know what to say. And that, as I say, is the challenge that the existence of both Catholicism and Orthodoxy offers the Protestant. Who is Christ? What does it mean? What's the whole shtick?
One more question, and then we should probably... Yeah.
Oh, and would you hand this, please, to Clara Sharp?
Claire is left. Yeah, she's abandoned us.
Sandra, would you be so kind? This is the last question.
Yeah, the woman back there.
Yes, sir.
No, it was actually this lady's been...
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Sorry.
I actually just wanted to respond to the question about as far as like practical things going on in the Archdiocese. I don't know if some of you here have heard of the One Witness Conference in Azusa, but it's an effort on the part of Bishop O'Connell to do an ecumenical conference about the new evangelization, and it's bringing together various evangelical pastors and like speakers who are ministers in their own communities, as well as Catholics who are attending Mass and adoration, just as like a side thing. If you haven't heard of it, it's a cool new, I think, movement in ecumenism. So.
It's called what again?
One Witness.
Okay.
There's a Facebook event for it, and it's coordinated by Bishop O'Connell of the San Gabriel region, and it's Catholics and evangelicals, non-denominationals, Pentecostals coming together, like speakers from within their own communities, to share about our one common witness.
That's great.
Yeah.
It would happen in Llizo.
It's next. It's July 22nd. It's Saturday. It's like an all-day conference in Azusa.
That's brilliant.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our time together is coming to its end. Before we pop off, a couple of quick things. One is that we'd like to thank you all for coming, of course. I should also mention that one of the most wonderful things, speaking of archdiocesan events, that I attended in recent years was with Archbishop Gomez at an Armenian church to commemorate the Edict of Milan. And it didn't get nearly enough play. But there were some Orthodox hierarchs there, some Catholics, Armenians, oddly enough, it being their church. And that's the kind of thing also we should focus on. The things we already have in common. If we do that, if we begin to think of each other as members of a fractious but nevertheless integrally united family, things will somehow or other work themselves out, even if we're our usual selves. So, having said all of that, next month, August, second Monday, probably wondering what we're going to be doing. Well, I'll tell you. Anglo-Catholicism and the origins of the ordinariate. And there you will find the awful truth. And Father, you'll be happy to know that you folks will get mentioned. So if you come back, you'll be able to stop me from maligning you. No, I knew the founder of Father's Church. He was a tremendous guy. Anyway, so with that, may I ask for 4 rounds of applause. First, for Doc Llizo. Second, for the long-suffering Eric and Liz Boydson. It's because of them that we'll look good on TV instead of what you saw tonight. And for Father Fenton.
And for Charles Coulombe.
Yeah.
I was actually going to say for Griffins of Kinsale, but never mind. So, thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Be careful on your way home. Remember that drunk drivers are happy drivers. What? Forget that. All right, thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. God willing, we'll see you next month.